Well, we're back in Jeremiah chapter 27. I've labeled this particular chapter the fight with the false prophets, and you'll see why here. This continues a section that we began yesterday in chapter 26 and extends through to chapter 29 that is all about the opposition that Jeremiah faced. Last time we saw opposition from his enemies. They wanted to put him to death. Here we see false prophets in chapter 27. In chapter 28 and 29, we'll see two specific false prophets that oppose Jeremiah. So again, Jeremiah is chronicling or arranging topically the opposition that he faced. Again, I think it's to make the case against Israel and why God ultimately crushes Jerusalem, destroys the temple, and takes his people into captivity. Verse 1 of chapter 27 kind of nails us into 597 BC. Again, it's about 11 years before the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. So there's a warning here. Startling thing happens here in verse 2. You know, sometimes the Lord uses these imagery, pictures, not only verbal pictures, but also examples, makes an example out of his prophets to fix things in our memory, I think. And that's what happens here. The Lord said to me, that is to Jeremiah, make yourself straps and yoke bars and put them on your neck. So the Lord tells Jeremiah here basically to make a yoke like you would put into an ox into, strap that to you. And what he's doing here is this is going to be kind of a physical picture, a memorable picture of the bondage they're going to have to Nebuchadnezzar and the bondage that the Lord is actually recommending they adopt. So as Jeremiah put on this yoke, so the nations and ultimately Jerusalem is supposed to do that. So let's take a big picture look at the chapter here. Verses 1 through 11 is Jeremiah's message to the nations. Verses 12 through 15 is a specific message to the king, to Zedekiah. And then 16 through 22 are a message to the priests and the people. So let's look at the message to the nations here. You know, before I get into this, it's important to remember that in Jeremiah's day, there were no atheists. There were lots of polytheists, but no atheists. Everybody believed in at least one God, oftentimes or more predominantly, probably many gods. But they were all believing in the supernatural, and they all sought guidance and direction from prophets and diviners who claimed to have knowledge of the future through supernatural means. So that's kind of the background here, to keep that in mind, as Jeremiah addresses in verses 3 and 4 representatives of 5 nations that are going to be returning to their own kings, to their own nation, with God's message. So here is a true prophet prophesying and sending this message to the nations. And God's message is this, verses 5 through 7. God's message to them is he is giving the land and all that is in the land over to Nebuchadnezzar. Let's read that for a second. It is I who, by my great power and my outstretched arm, have made the earth with all the men and the animals that are on the earth, and I give it to whomever it seems right to me. Now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and I have given him to also the beasts of the field to serve him. All the nations shall serve him, and his sons and his grandson, until the time of his own land comes. Then many nations and great kings shall make him their slave. So God is essentially saying here that He is going to give Nebuchadnezzar the land that these nations inhabit, everything in that land, and it's going to last for a certain period of time. That's 70 years that we've seen it before. Note particularly, though, how God really grounds his authority in doing this in the fact that he is creator, that he has created everything, that it all belongs to him. If you deny that Genesis 1 is history, if you look at it and say, well, it's myth, or it's just a poetic way of talking about the creation of the earth, then you take away God's authority, because he grounds what he's doing here in the fact that he created the heavens and the earth, the land and all that's in it. Further, I think you should take note of the fact that this is the same authority that God uses to give Israel itself a specific land. You know, God created the nations in Genesis chapter 10, and then in Genesis chapter 12, he kind of throws us a curveball in that he creates a new nation himself, not out of the children of Noah, not out of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, but he creates his own nation, and he kind of throws them in the midst of the nations that exist already and say that their land is now yours, that God is exercising this authority. So good thing to note that God is doing this. Verse 8, he warns them, if any nation or kingdom will not serve Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and put its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, I will punish that nation. And he goes on to say how he's going to punish them. But they must submit. Verses 9 to 10 then is a warning against the prophets in these lands. Remember, I told you that they had their own prophets that were using supposedly supernatural means to know the future. Do not listen to your prophets, your diviners, your dreamers, your fortune tellers, or your sorcerers who are saying to you, you shall not serve the king of Babylon. So he's warning these nations, don't listen to them. Now, be an interesting discussion, kind of beyond the scope of what I'm doing here, but myself, I'm sure that some of these that he lists here, these prophets and diviners and dreamers and fortune tellers, are just making things up out of their own mind in order to try to maybe get money or get prestige. I think some of them also may be deceived by demons who are trying to disrupt God's plan. I think that happens today as well. I think we have false teachers in the church that are just influenced by other false teachers that maybe are pursuing money or prestige or fame. But others, I think, maybe a smaller majority, just enough to disrupt everything, are teaching the doctrines of demons. These are men that are teaching things that are from the pit of hell, influenced by Satan. So, if they listen then to and submit to Nebuchadnezzar, in verse 11, God is going to allow those nations to stay in their land. Now he turns to Zedekiah. To Zedekiah, king of Judah, in verse 12, I spoke in like manner. Bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon, and serve him and his people, and live. Not a patriotic message here at all, right? He is telling the nation of Israel that they need to submit or suffer the same consequences as the nations around them. Verses 14 and 15, these are a second warning against false prophets. This time, false prophets speaking to God's people. And the result of listening to their false prophecies will be that they are driven from the land. Finally, in verse 16, he turns to the people, the priests. Verses 16 to 17, again, another warning against listening to false prophets. You know, Jesus repeats this for his people in Matthew chapter 24, the Olivet Discourse, where he warns them over and over again about false prophets, false Christs, false messiahs. It's a warning again in the Olivet Discourse to Israel. The church has its own warnings about these things, but this is specifically for Israel, and it will be in Jesus' day as well. In this case, the message of the prophets is that they're saying that all those vessels that were taken away to the temple in the first exile in 605, all that was Daniel talks about in Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, all those things that were taken away, they're saying that it's going to be returned. Verse 18 then, we see that the false prophets are challenged to prophesy that the remaining vessels in the temple would not be taken to Babylon. Verses 19 through 22, this section closes with God determining not only that they would be taken until he returns his people and restores them to the land. So this is the true message from God, not the false message of the false prophets that Jeremiah is warning against. So with all these warnings about false prophets and the warnings that the church has in 1 Timothy 4, for example, 2 Timothy 3, Jude, 2 Peter, all the warnings we have about false teachers and false prophets, we can say, I think, that everyone has the responsibility to discern false from true prophets. It's not going to be enough to stand before the Lord when he is handing out rewards for his church and plead that we were led astray, that we were lied to and we believed them. That's not going to be a plea because God has given us his word. We need to hold teachers, preachers, pastors in the church today accountable to the standard of God's word. So brothers and sisters, I pray for you to be in God's word so much that you to develop the discernment that's necessary to keep you on the right track and to not lose the rewards that God has planned for you to have in the future. So God bless you, brothers and sisters, and enjoy the rest of Jeremiah as we plow through this very long book of the Old Testament. Jeremiah is actually about 5% of the total content of the Bible. So by going through Jeremiah with me, you are coming to a clear and careful understanding of a large portion of God's Word. So God bless you and enjoy Jeremiah.